some happy endings. There'll be dreams that don't come true. But in the times ahead, there's love and hate and hope.
Welcome to 3%. This is a special, sort of maybe a supplementary podcast and something that we're going to put on the website. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, obviously, and I'm joined today by Jonathan Dunne from Small Stations and one of the big translators from Spanish and from Galician. How are you doing?
Very well, Chad. Thanks very much for having me along. It's funny to be talking to you at such a great distance across the Atlantic and just talking into my phone, but there you go, the wonders of modern technology.
It is kind of weird. It's a different experience. But this is part of our monthly focus on Spain. I've been writing things about like books translated from Castilian, from Spanish, from Catalan, and we'll be doing Basque next week. But I want to do something from Galician as well, which is the fourth major language from Spain. And when I was running, you might have seen this post, but I ran like a bunch of numbers about books translated from Spain for the introductory post for the month. And Small Stations is the third largest publisher of books from Spain in the world, or in the English-speaking world, that is.
It's an amazing statistic, and in the beginning I was kind of chuffed and a little bit pleased to read that. I'm very grateful to you for giving it your attention. And then afterwards, I began to feel that maybe it wasn't such a good thing. And actually, I should feel a little bit sad about it, that other publishers, especially those with greater resources, are not doing more to have translated literature published in English. And it's being left to people like me and others to carry the weight of that, because it is a bit of a financial risk, I think, publishing translated literature at the moment. And while it's a really lovely calling, it doesn't do your bank balance much good. So I was a little sorry in the end that there weren't bigger publishers, perhaps with employees who actually receive a salary, doing a little bit more to have translated literature published in English, and it's really being left to smaller publishing houses like mine and others like Hisper Books and so on. To carry that weight. But I think that's something we'll talk about, how this is being left to individuals, I think, at the moment, and not, institutions are not always doing what they could to help the process along. It's really, I think, translation at the moment, publishing of translations is being left greatly to individuals to do. And I don't think that's really how it should be. That's not, for me, cultural policy. That's individual goodwill.
Yeah, that's a very good point. A very good way of putting it too, especially since we'll get into the grant situation and other things, but with the attention that's paid to the books, that's very proportionate towards the larger corporate institutions and not towards these individuals. So you get all the attention paid to the places that are doing things as like financial, but for the finances, for money, for profit, for the significance of that, and have a lot of employees that are paid and that are able to do all that stuff. But the ones that are just doing it as individuals get like very little of the attention that can be allocated, which makes it really difficult and just furthers that gap.
I think that's absolutely right. It's the situation is a little bit upside down. Departments that have maybe publishing houses, that have a publicity department, you could cope so much better. And I think, we're producing, I'm not sure how many, there were maybe about 40 titles over the last 10 years. I've never had a journalist from mainstream media get in touch and say, what have you done recently? What could I review? And I think we've been around long enough since 2007 that, a journalist who writes book reviews should perhaps already have some knowledge of what we're doing, and especially the fact that our books are structured in series, so they're very easy to identify. We have a series of contemporary fiction, we have a series of young adult fiction, we have a series of classics, and so on, poetry, essay, and so on. So it's pretty easy to identify what's being done. And I think the situation at the moment, probably the same for Hisper Books and other people like us, is that you're really relying on, again, individual goodwill, which in terms of reviews comes down to book bloggers rather than mainstream media. And I think that's a real shame.
To add to that, like in a bad way, there was an article this week about how the book blog is dead.
Yeah.
There are no more book blogs. There's only the mainstream media, which was a surprise. because we still, I guess we sort of consider ourselves a blog, but whatever. Before I want to talk more about all that you're bringing up, but just to back up a little bit for anyone who's listening, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a Galician translator and publisher?
Well, I studied classics at university in England, and having left university, I decided I wanted to go and experience a different culture. And it seemed to me obvious to go to the south of Europe because I'd studied Latin and Greek. And I ended up going to Galicia in the northwest of Spain, which is just above Portugal, because I'd heard it had amazing. Lugo, where I was, has an amazing Roman wall, so that sort of appealed to me. And beautiful countryside, beautiful mountains, beautiful coast as well, very dramatic with the Atlantic Ocean there. And I just really, fell on my feet. I really enjoyed my experience. I went over to Barcelona and studied Galician in Barcelona, actually, not in Galicia, and had contact with a lot of Galician people. And I just really felt very well with the culture, and very soon started to translate. But publishing, I probably started translating Galician literature into English in 1993. Publishing I started in 2007, as I said earlier. That was really, I think, because I felt that not enough was getting done. It's pretty obvious, I think. So, up until that stage, I think about 30 books of Galician literature had been published in English since 1964 to about 2007. So not a great number. And since then, in the last 10 years, that number from about 30 has risen to almost 100. So it's it's exponential growth. It's increased hugely, and we're a large part of that, I think. To give an example, Rosalía de Castro, who's quite a well-known Galician author. She's kind of the matriarch of Galician letters, writing poetry in the 19th century. Her two main books of Galician poetry, Galician Songs and New Leaves, had not been produced in English complete. There were, one or two unequal anthologies of her poems, but not the actual works themselves. And that was more than 150 years after she'd been writing. And she's well known. She studied in universities, and if you come into contact with Galician literature, you will very quickly come into contact with the names Rosalía de Castro, as well as Manuel Rivas, who's more contemporary.
Yeah, he's the one that I think I came across first.
Yeah.
Through your translation, actually, of Books Burned Badly.
Oh, it's a great book, that. It takes a little while to get in, but once you're in, wow. I just was amazed by his stamina.
So, are there any characteristics of, and you, how do you, is Galician? This is the ignorant question of words I've never spoken out loud.
Not at all. Some people say Galician, some people say Galician.
Galician, got it. Okay, but are there any characteristics of Galician writing that would distinguish it from other parts of Spain?
Yeah, I think there are. I think one of the main characteristics would have to do with the Spanish Civil War and the influence of that on Galicia. I know Manuel Rivas has written a lot about that. I think also the supernatural. There's quite a lot of supernatural in authors like Agustín Fernández Paz, and I think that has to do with a lot of the myths and legends that abound in Galicia. And I think also a real lovely ability of storytelling. They're great storytellers, and I think that also has a lot to do with the tradition of telling stories around a fire. So oral Galician literature for a long time, maybe 500 years or something, was only oral. There was nothing written down because there was no money to do it. It was stories that were handed down from one generation to another. So it was a literature of oral tradition. And I think that really shows even today in the ability of Galician writers to tell stories. They're really good storytellers. Apart from other things that you might add, they have a similar sense, I think, to the English, a certain amount of irony, and very poetic as well. An author like Manuel Rivas he's also a poet, and he's a very poetic writer.
Yeah, that's very true. How many, just to put this in context too, how many speakers of Galician are there compared to like Catalan or Basque?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because people they've heard of Spanish, obviously, then they've heard of Catalan because of Barcelona, and they've heard of Basque probably because of the situation in the Basque country over many years. Galician's the one that gets left out because I think because Catalonia and the Basque Country traditionally have been economically quite important, whereas Galicia was a bit like Ireland, rural, farming, fishing, a lot of emigration, in particular to Latin America. And so it's the last language that people generally have heard of. And yet it's the second biggest minority language in Europe after Catalan and before Welsh, as I understand. So you've got about 3 million speakers. Though you could probably double that if you included the diaspora. So and the language is connected with Portuguese, of course, not with Spanish. It is a language in its own right. It's a Romance language, very similar to Portuguese. In fact, they only went their separate ways when Portugal became a separate political entity. But up until that stage, it was one language called Galician Portuguese.
Oh, that's interesting too.
Yeah.
Did not know that at all. So so you started Small Stations in 2007. What was like your impetus? Was it just the desire to get some more of these books out there?
Absolutely, to get more of these books out there and to make them more available, because I think there are some really, really great authors and they're just not getting the attention they deserve. It's been a really lovely experience, I think, publishing over the last 10 years, but I could say that my personal savings have gone from 10,000 euros to 140 euros in that time. So you can imagine what the onus is on you as an individual, especially if you've got a family, to carry on with that kind of process. But I have a very strong Christian faith, which helps me a great deal. I don't think I would have done it without that. So I believe that there is another level, and it's important to do these things, even if they look difficult. It's important to do them because translation is essential. You know, you're in America and I'm in Bulgaria. We're based in Bulgaria. I don't think I would be able to do this if I was based in the UK, because I wouldn't be able to devote this sort of time to translating and editing. And I think it's really important to have people who are translating all the time, not academics who translate in the summer a book, but people who are translating all the time, because you must have that continuity, you must have that constancy. And, you know, I've learned a lot being a translator, a professional translator over the last 25 years. I've just gone deeper and deeper and deeper into the language. And actually what was interesting for me is I've ended up, the language that has ended up opening itself to me is English, not Galician or Spanish or any other. I've actually ended up, in a sense, translating from English into English. Yeah, about 14 years ago, I just moved to Bulgaria, and the whole language seemed to disintegrate in front of me, in front of my eyes, and then it just reconstructed itself. And it took about 6 months, and it was a very interesting, intense experience. And I just began to see the whole language in a different way. And since then, I would say my experience of translation has changed. The other thing that I think has changed enormously over the years is when I began, I thought translation was all about activity, was all doing things. It was all down to how much I did, you know, dictionaries, research, reading books. It was all down to my activity. And then I came to realize that, yes, it's important to have this horizontal process of preparation of the text, reading the text, consulting the author, looking up things you don't know, checking references on the internet. But when it comes to the actual process of translation, this is a question of listening. It's a vertical process, not a horizontal one. And I became aware that this voice we all hear when we're writing something down on a piece of paper, because you've got to write something down. And if you hear no voice, you're not going to write anything down. That voice, you can rely on it. You can trust it. And it begins to flow in a way. And that was my biggest realization, I think, as a translator, that you go from activity to listening.
Wow, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And like, seems it fits in with a lot of things that we've talked about on the podcast and about just translation in general, about the idea that the best translations are the ones that capture the voice. So being better at the listening part of it really would facilitate that.
Absolutely. And I think the idea that the text should flow as well. I mean, people can become very obsessed about whether you've translated a particular word in the right way or whether you've used a different word. To be honest with you, I don't think that really matters. I think what's important is that you remain faithful to the flow, to the thread of the translation. It's so important that you don't break the thread. And if you become too intellectual, too rational about it, you run the risk of doing that. And people very often ask, well, surely the most difficult thing to translate is poetry. Actually, I don't think so at all. You mentioned Books Bound Badly. That was much more difficult to translate because it's a long novel and you have to keep the thread going over a period of maybe 10, 12 months, whereas a poem you can do in a day. So you don't have this tension that you have to maintain attention over such a long period with poetry as you do with novels. So I actually think long novels are the most difficult to translate because you have to live with them for a long period. And it's not just when you're translating, it's sort of permanently there, and you have to keep the tension, because if you lose the tension, you'll lose the translation in a sense, I think. So this is what I mean, I think, about the voice. It's the flow, it's the thread that you have to keep going.
That's great. That's a great way of putting it too. I really like that idea of like the poems being easier because of that time constraint and the ability to stay focused on it. How many books have you translated now?
About 55 or something like that.
Oh, wow. Okay. How many from the different languages?
Mostly from Galician, and then I've translated from Spanish. I did a book from Catalan, In the Last Blue, by Carme Riera. They're hoping to make a film of that book. And then I've done some books of Bulgarian poetry, but not prose. As you know, Angela Rodel is working a lot with Bulgarian prose and some others as well.
That's actually, it's funny that you bring her up. So that's a similar situation to what I see for Galician writing right now, where like you two are like the main translators. And everyone, if you come to know Bulgarian literature or Galician literature, it's through the two of you. How do you feel about that situation? Are there other people who are working, younger translators that are coming up that you want to encourage, or what's that situation like?
I think there's a very healthy situation at the moment. Talking of Galician literature, you've got an older generation, people like John Rutherford, Kathleen March, Caris Evans. Certainly, it's not just me by a long stretch of the imagination. Erin Moore up in Canada, she's doing a lot of poetry. So I think all of those are very important. But then you've got a younger generation coming through. And I think it's really important that we don't, forget them or overlook them, because they need to be encouraged. You've got people like Jacob Rogers, Scott Shanahan, Harriet Cook, people like that who are just starting out. And I think they need to feel a certain amount of encouragement, because it's really important to have people who are going to, take on the work that the rest of us have been doing. But I would say from Galician literature, active translators, there are probably 10, 15. Keith Payne, he's based in Galicia, he's doing a lot of poetry. Lorna Shaughnessy in Ireland, she's doing a lot of poetry. So no, I wouldn't, I'd be worried if it was only me or one or two others. It's not the case at all, not the case at all. And it's really lovely because there's a very good community spirit. I'm in contact a lot with other translators, either as friends or because I'm editing a translation of theirs. So I think there's a very good community spirit, which is important, because you don't, a lot of the work is quite isolated. You're in a little room, and you don't see so much of the outside world when you're actually in the process of translating on a computer. And it's important, I think, to have a good community spirit among translators. And I think with Galician literature, that's definitely the case. Also with the authors, really lovely, lovely people to work with. But as I say, I think very important people like Scott Shanahan and Jacob Rogers, who are coming through, both based in the States, or both American anyway. And I'm really excited to see what they will end up doing. But it's difficult, because how are you going to manage? And it's fine when you're in your 20s, but how are you going to manage when you're in your 30s and maybe you get married and you have a family? Can you survive as a literary translator? And to be honest with you, at the moment, I think this idea that literary translation is a profession is a joke. It's not a profession at all. We are clinging on, I would say. I mentioned about my savings earlier on. That may sound like some funny statistic, but in the middle of the night, it doesn't always sound like a funny statistic. And then you've got the fact that you're going to hit retirement age. And if you've been translating self-employed, freelance all this time, no one really is going to pay you a pension. You're not based at a university that you're going to.
It's funny when you mentioned that we talked about that a bunch recently on these podcasts, where there's like the ability to get people who are younger that are interested in book selling, in translation, in like publishing, in like this sort of book culture world where we know there's not a lot of money or a lot of like, it's very rare that you make a lot of money in any one of these professions. And like there's a good way to get like younger people involved, and they get involved, but there's no, and people who are very, very experienced, say like the Margaret Joel Costa or Edie Grossman or Pavir and Volokhonsky, like the people who are super established and have made it through the middle phase, can do very well for themselves and can function as freelance translators. Or if you're a store owner, you can own your own bookstore, that sort of thing. But that middle gap to go from like your 20s to 30s, like you say, is like it's a huge lack in the way that our culture is set up right now to like support people going through that phase of life. Where you can take your like energy and change it into grand expertise and like established expertise, which sort of brings up the next thing that I really wanted to ask you about, which bringing up Angela was kind of supposed to be a segue too, is that in relation to Angela and Bulgarian literature, there's a few foundations, mostly the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, that helped fund new translations of Bulgarian books, who helped fund like younger translators learning how to become professional translators of Bulgarian to English or to other languages. And I was wondering what the situation is funding-wise for you guys, and because we mentioned HISPA books a couple of times too, and my understanding is that they've closed down, and I thought it was due in part to the funding situation, but I don't have any specifics on that. I just know that they've gone like radio silence for like a year and a half.
That's right. I'm really sorry about that. I don't know any more than you do. I mean, I think the main thing and the good thing is that their books are there and they're available for people to read them, and that's great. I don't know what the current situation is with them in Madrid. I don't know about funding possibilities for translations from Galician. Obviously, the main source is the Galician government. That's the regional government in Galicia. But I would say they're not proactive enough. So they, put out some translation grants every year. You have to jump through a series of hoops, which get more and more difficult year by year. They started, with some very nice translation grants of between 25 and 50 euros per page. Then with the crisis in 2013, they dropped down to 20 euros a page. Now, 20 euros a page, if you're being paid that as a translator, you are going to do no more than survive. So you may not even cover your costs. So that for me is worrying. There are two things that are worrying for me. One is the beginning of the stage, what you're getting paid to translate the book, and 20 euros per page is not enough. The UK Translators Association recommends 38 euros a page. So you're basically getting paid half. Now you can imagine that half you're losing is what you would save with, buy a new car with, go on holiday with, all these things, and cover other expenses that come up out of the blue. So I think it's very worrying, and they haven't responded to my repeated, questions about this, that it's really not enough and it's way under the recommended rate. And that worries me. There's a little bit of radio silence from them. And that's at the beginning of the process, the difficulties of making the application, the fact that the onus is always on you as the publisher to make the application, to get the money, to prove that you're not stealing the money, that you're not misusing the funds or whatever. And that's a draining process. After a while, you begin to get a little fed up, of we're cultured people. We're trying to promote their culture, and you always feel that the onus is on you to make the application, to provide all the documents, which, as I say, get a little bit more and more complicated. And often you don't get the grant until well after you've done the books. So who's paying up front? You are, as an individual. And then I think at the end of the process, when the book is ready, you've got the problem that there's very, very little coverage of the books you've done. So sales are going to be limited until people know about them. And that's really, for me, mainly about, newspapers and the press and so on. And also even some of the there's no budget for promotion, and even some of the literary prizes, you're very open-minded, I know, and your prizes are available for everyone, but often they're limited to publishers who are geographically based in one particular country, and you cannot apply if you're not based in one particular country, and we're based in Bulgaria for obvious reasons, and I don't see why that matters in this day and age. Our books are distributed throughout the world. The fact that I'm based in Bulgaria or based anywhere else, I don't think is particularly relevant. What matters is the quality of the literature that's being produced. I saw recently that Warwick University had brought out a prize for translation of women writers. Great, lovely. But only books published in the UK can apply for that prize. So you're immediately limiting the field that can enter the prize, that the prize is available to. And I don't see why, for example, literary prizes, why they're putting those limits. There's no need. Do it on the quality of the literature, assuming that the literature is widely available, which ours is.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the only catch that we ever use at the Best Translated Book Award, is that a bookseller here in the States can order the book and stock it.
Yeah.
That's really the call. That's like, there's all sorts of like weird gray areas and things that sort of get into funny parts. But the main impetus was like, if you win the prize and a bookstore wants to sell your book to a reader, can they do that? And when the answer is like,
exactly,
not really, then we don't want that book to win. We don't want it to be included just for that reason. So I think that the point is to get it to people. So,
and I think another thing. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the book's got to be available and for people to buy either online or through a bookshop. And I think the other thing as well, I noticed, for example, say our classics do very well because they're well-known authors. Rosalia, Carlos Casares. People have heard of these authors and they're keen to buy them and give them to friends and read them themselves in English and so on. And our fiction does pretty well. We've got some really nice authors like Xavier Queipo and Miguel Angel Fernandez, Manuel Rivas. We've got titles, Susa de Toro, and so on. And they do pretty well. The series that for me people are just missing out on at the moment is the young adult fiction. They have such strong young adult fiction in Galicia. Very often they win the national prize for young adult fiction, the Spanish National Book Award for young people's literature. And they're very often included in the IBI honor list and the White Ravens catalogue. They've got really, really lovely young adult fiction titles and really, really lovely illustrations in some of them. But they're for young adults, not children. And we have a whole series with about 16, 17 titles. Really lovely stories, and people just don't know about them. They're just not, people are not giving them attention. And when I've tried to get in contact with people and suggest that maybe it's a really nice series and could they just don't do it. I don't know why. Is it because it's translated literature? The books are widely available. There's no problem. The price is reasonable. It's just a real conundrum. So I think there are difficulties at the start of the process with the translation grants because they're low. And there are difficulties at the end of the process because there's just no money for promotion. And, I'm working with a Galician culture that has a big cultural budget. The autonomous government in Galicia has a big cultural budget. There's an institution in Santiago, a Council of Galician Culture, that when I was living in Santiago briefly, I remember it was getting €2 million a year to organize conferences, things at university, stuff like that. To be honest with you, I'm not quite sure what they do. Now, we are working on a paltry amount, and they're just not prepared at the moment to face the need for an office of translation to promote and increase the visibility of their literature, which is, there are some really great titles, as I said. They've got 10 or 12 winners of the Spanish National Book Award in Galicia, Galician writers who've won that award. And there's just some really, really lovely stuff, but you've got to promote it. You can't just give low grants and then say, well, that's enough. One thing they do is support a very nice website, which is the Portico of Galician Literature, and that's where you can find information on books of Galician literature that have already appeared in English. And you can also read fragments of works by contemporary authors who've not appeared yet, or some of them haven't. And that's a very nice website, galicianliterature.gal. It's a very nice website, and that's something that's supported by the Galician government. But there's so much more you can do, and there is money around. But it's the same with the European Union. I just think there isn't an enlightened attitude, and there isn't initiative on their part to say, what can we do to help you? There is silence. From institutions, there is silence. And that's very disheartening when you've been working 10 years and putting everything you've got into something, that you're not getting more support. And I think we should be getting more support. European Union, for example, I don't even bother going to the European Union. They've got a lot of money. But I don't even bother going to them because their translation grants, as I read, the translation must be no more than 50% of the cost of the project. Now, that's absurd. Everyone knows that the translation is the main cost. So if you're doing a project that the translation for which you're receiving the money is under 50% of the project, you for sure are losing money, or you're cooking the books, one or the other, because there's no other way of doing it. The translation, the cost of the translation is always the main cost. The other things you can do on a smaller budget, but you've got to pay the translator. And I think it's very unreasonable to put a limit of 50% of the cost of the project on the translation grant. So we don't even bother applying, and that's a real shame, because I'm working with Galician and English, one of the main minority languages in Europe, and the international language, which is English. I should be getting support. I should be one of the first publishing houses on their list, because I'm doing exactly what the European Union is supposed to stand for, which is understanding, communication, and so on.
Yeah, and you're based in Bulgaria, to add in another European country. It's like the perfect combination.
Yeah.
Oh man, funding is always disappointing and difficult.
Yeah.
But the European situation always seems more complicated to me. Like when we fill out the forms for our grants for like the Spanish books that we do, like we have to get everything translated into Spanish. We have to get everything has to be done in like such a rigorous and Baroque sort of way. I can't imagine, like, the European Union seems like that multiplied by 100.
Absolutely, and what worries me also, I think, is that a lot of the people who are implementing policies, they're not cultural people. They're probably bureaucrats or lawyers. So I don't think they're coming maybe always from the right place. I mean, if you're a book person, you will be much better informed. You'll know what the situation is. It'll be much more sympathetic, I think, to what publishers are having to deal with. And it sometimes feels like we have to do everything. If I sit down and twiddle my thumbs, nothing will happen. So it's all on you. And I mean, fair enough for you, I do my work, but I think there has to be a little help from the other side. It shouldn't just be you. But I'm sure if you spoke to Jill Schoolman at Archipelago Books or someone at New Directions or anywhere else, they would probably say more or less the same thing, and it would be a gripe. I don't want to gripe, because I think translation is a beautiful thing. I think everything we do in this human life is translation. We are translators. We're not authors. And the idea that translation is a form of writing is rubbish. Writing is a form of translation. We all when you write a book, you yourself write a book, you are translating. You're translating your experiences, you're translating what you've heard, you're translating your ideas, you're translating what's coming to you onto a piece of paper. So you are translating. When we eat, we translate. When we breathe, we translate. When we hold a conversation, we translate. Everything we do, we translate in our mother's womb when we receive nourishment and oxygen. So everything we do is translation. We are translators. What happens in this world is that people want to be authors. They want to say, this is mine. I own it. And I draw a line around it. And if you cross that line, do you see how close line is with mine? If you cross that line, there's going to be trouble. And that's basically what's happening in the world. All the problems that the world faces, shortages, people not having enough, people having too much, are all down to this idea that we are authors and things belong to us. Nothing belongs to us except our souls. Nothing. Not even life. Because I didn't invent life. I didn't come up with life. I didn't make it up. It was given to me. And if I'm lucky, I pass it on to my child. It comes through me. Now, if it comes through me, not from me, that means I'm a translator. Same with abstract things like love, for example. I'm not capable of endless love. I'm limited, but it passes through me. Do you understand? It doesn't come from me. And I think you have to have a much wider understanding of what translation is and the importance of translation. Translation is not some second-rate, dirty, inferior activity where you're not getting what you could be getting if you were getting the original. This is nonsense. Sometimes I would say in the process of translation, I think the translation is better than the original. I quite often have situations where maybe there's a reference that's incorrect, so I correct it. Or sometimes the sentence in the original, the syntax is not so brilliant. I think it's quite possible for a translation to be better than the original, or at least to be as good. It simply happens at another time and in another place. But that's all. And we've so many hang-ups about translation that we haven't processed and we haven't got through. And I'd like to say something else, because translation is translating from one language into another. But I also think there's so much more about language that we're not talking about and we don't realize. We are surrounded by language. The environment is a form of language, but we haven't understood this. And we are very ignorant. And we walk around the world and the environment in which we are, and we see it, what we're going to do. And I think the environment is also full of language if you can read it, but we can't, or most of us can't. And the same with our own language. English, for example, the words that make up the English language are full of information. The words themselves, I'm talking about the letters that they're made up of. But we don't talk about this. We don't realize it. If you go and study English at university, you will never hear that.
No, definitely not. That's fascinating. I really like everything that you just said is really affirming and great. And I think a lot of translators would really respond to that too. Have you ever written a book about translation?
I have some books on language. I've got a new book coming out in March, Stones of Ithaca, which is about meaning inside language, meaning inside the environment. These things that I've just been talking about. That there's so much more to these things than we think or than we realize. But my main book is The DNA of the English Language, which looks at the meaning of words. And what meaning is inside the words themselves. And I think it's very beautiful to start with, and also very important, because if you walk around this world being blind or half blind, you're potentially missing out on something that's very important. And we gain our physical sight quite quickly, but I think there is another form of sight, a spiritual sight, that comes much more slowly and with much more work. And this for me is very much connected with the process of translation, because you've got to be able to read the signs.
Yeah. So in addition to getting you to plug your own books, which books from small stations would you recommend to the listening audience?
Well, I think some of the young adult fiction are really, really lovely. There's a book about a boy growing up in a village in Iraq, and Brother of the Wind, and all the difficulties he has to face when American troops turn up. Heart of Jupiter, about a schoolgirl who suffers a case of cyber bullying, and it's a very intense tale. Some of the supernatural stuff by Agustín Fernández Paz. He's a very well-known, very popular author. Xavier Queipo, based in Brussels, he's got a novel called Kite. That's very interesting, about an emigrant living in the States who comes home to Galicia and the experiences he goes through. Black Nightshade by Teresa Moure is another very nice book, historical book about the relationship between Queen Christina of Sweden and some of the other people she comes into contact with, including the French philosopher Descartes. We've got some Manuel Rivas stories, 1 Million Cows. That's a really lovely story, typical humor, very, very short, but very sweet. Lots of books. Just go to the website, smallstations.com, and you can just flick through the publications page and you'll find everything that's there with a little description, which will give you an idea of it, if it appeals to you or not. But there's some really great stuff. We've got about 40 books of Galician literature, and I think there's something for everybody there.
There is, and I'm going to have, if you're listening to this through like a normal podcast, as a podcast, you should go to the 3% website, because I'll have a whole write-up on all the books that were just mentioned, plus like everything else that I can include about small stations, so it'll be easy to like bounce from one place to the other. So we'll highlight as many books as possible, and then go to like you say, go to smallstations.com and definitely check out all the books. They're all really pretty and very interesting. And the young adult thing, not to dwell too long on this, but it's fascinating because there has been a movement recently of people mentioning that there are translated children's books, translated adult books, but this middle section that's the most popular type of literature in America right now is generally left out. And yet you're filling that void as best you can and not getting the attention that it deserves. So anyone who's listening who's like a YA enthusiast, definitely go check out all of these books, because I think it'd be really fantastic to get more attention for all of them.
It's so kind of you, Chad, to mention that. I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, I personally, I have an 11-year-old son, so I'm very keen on young adult fiction. I actually read young adult fiction myself, partly because I translate a lot of it, but I just simply enjoy it, and I love the way that they concentrate on just telling a story. Whereas I sometimes find with adult fiction, sometimes maybe too much emphasis is placed on technique and not so much on the actual content of the story. And what I love about young adult fiction is it's just a good story. You just really get into it and you really enjoy the characters and you really enjoy finding out what's going to happen. And they're so inventive. I find young adult authors so inventive in what they do. And it's something I really love about them. And there are some, really entertaining stories, some set in more realistic situations, like this boy growing up in a village in Iraq during the Iraq War, which is obviously a very real situation to face. And then there are some books like Tartarus by Antonio Manuel Fraga, where it's set in an imaginary world, and a girl has to go with a boy into an underworld to save the day. And it's just really, really lovely stuff. And I think there's a really nice variety of themes in the series Galician Wave of young adult fiction. So really, you can find a bit of everything there. That
all sounds fantastic. I don't have any other questions for you. Do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, just really grateful for the work you're doing with 3% and Open Letter Books. We're great admirers of both the things that you're doing, and just really happy that you're doing all this work, and very grateful to you for giving attention to other people like me who are doing similar work and working in the same vein and pushing in the same direction. And I think it's really lovely and open-minded of you, actually, to be giving attention not only to what you're doing, but to what other people are doing. And that's how it should be, because we're all working together. And I think we all have the same aims at heart. So just to thank you very much for what you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. It was great talking to you. This has been really, really exciting and really interesting conversation. I think a lot of people are going to really love too. So
great. Thanks a lot, Chad.
Dreams that don't come true, but in the times ahead there's love and hate and hope and dread come piling on. It makes it that much harder for you, yeah. I know you're worried, I'm worried too. here to fall with you.